Hi everyone, and welcome to The Neverending Story, The Cultural Evolution of Narratives, Part 7. In this lecture we'll be talking about crime fiction and how it might reflect processes of cumulative cultural evolution. This lecture is by me, Joe Stubbersfield, and Oleg Sobchuk. Crime. Crime fiction, whether that be mysteries, thrillers, whodunits, police procedurals, and detective fiction, is one of the most popular genres there are. Crime accounts for 20 to 40% of all fiction book sales in the Western world. It is also popular on TV and in film, and more recently, things like true crime podcasts have been increasingly popular. Crime fiction tends to feature complex plots, including suspense, mystery, and intrigue, and some of its appeal may lie in the fact that it provides a puzzle for the reader or audience to solve. When thinking about complexity in culture, it may be fairly obvious that the technology we use becomes more sophisticated with every decade and with every year. But how can we measure this increasing complexity? One example in terms of technology might be simply counting the number of parts. And you can see from this figure that the number of parts that go towards creating types of technology has increased across the decades. But how do we approach thinking about complexity with creative culture like narratives? Do narratives become more complex? And how might we measure this complexity in narratives? This question is rather interesting. The growing complexity of culture is one of the things that makes humans different from other animals. Is such complexity and growth also happening in the less likely domains of culture, such as narratives, compared to technology? One approach to answering this question will be to analyze stories using the information theoretical measures of complexity. For example, Patrick Uola has applied the measure of entropy to a large collection of Google books. He did this by looking at bigrams, two-word combinations. What he found was that during the 20th century, the number of unique types of bigrams has increased. He concludes that this alone indicates an increase in the complexity of written culture. However, Uola interprets this not as an indication of the growing complexity of literature, but rather as an indication of the growing complexity of the world around us. And he may be right. After all, the Google Books corpus contains much more than simply fiction, and even if it did just contain fiction alone, we would not be able to say that this complexity reflects an increase in the complexity of fiction versus an increase in the complexity of the reality that that fiction depicts. Clearly, we need a somewhat different approach to measuring the potential complexity and growth in narratives. But at the same time, we also need a better understanding in the growth of complexity in the first place. Why and how does technology become more complex? Knowing this, maybe we will also have a better idea of whether we should expect a similar growth of complexity in narratives, and of the possible ways of measuring this complexity. In cultural evolution, the growth of cultural complexity is explained with the theory of cumulative cultural evolution, or CCE. In recent years, CCE has become a subject of a large number of papers, but not all authors agree on what it is and how exactly it operates. But many authors seem to agree that two key components are important: the Ratchet effect and recombination. The Ratchet effect, described here by Tomasello, is the basic idea that cultural traditions and artifacts of human beings accumulate modifications over time. What happened was that some individual or group of individuals first invented a primitive version of the artifact or practice, and then some time later, user or users made a modification, an improvement, that others then adopted, perhaps without change for many generations, at which point some other individual or group of individuals made another modification, which was then learned and used by others, and so on over historical time. And you can see that depicted in this figure. So there's an initial artifact that a child learns through cultural learning, and then an individual or group of people create some kind of modification, and that now modified artifact is what is passed on to the next generation, and so on. The second key component is the recombining of innovations. Described here by Moquet. The mechanics of technological recombination differs from that of living beings. In biology, the genome contains information that can be characterized as a set of linear combinations between the male and female chromosomes. Innovations consist of changing weights. In all knowledge systems, including technological knowledge, no such constraints exist. Information can be taken from a large number of sources and added onto existing forms. To illustrate these two principles, the Ratchet effect and recombination, let's use a simple example of technological evolution, the history of bicycles. In 1818, a German inventor, Baron von Drais, created a wooden running machine which introduced a new innovation, the idea that a person can move faster using a simple two-wheeled device powered only by the person's own legs, compared that is to something which is drawn by a horse. The machine was mainly used by aristocrats and thus had a big problem. Using it would make one's aristocratic trousers dirty. To solve this dirty trousers problem, in 1821 an Englishman, Louis Gompertz, suggested that the running machine could move without the actual running part, and instead be powered by hands via a lever, so that their legs could be kept above the ground. The idea of a hand-powered bicycle turned out to be an evolutionary dead end, but Gompertz's bicycle had an important innovation, the very idea of indirect drive, in which the power is transmitted from the body to the wheels via gears. Sometime later, in 1869, Pierre Michaud created the first bicycle to be made of wrought iron, except for the wheels, which remained wooden. Overall, this innovation made bicycles lighter and more usable, and also contained another crucial innovation, pedals, which were used to power the front wheel. During the same year, there was another breakthrough, also in France. The watchmaker Guilmet presented the first bicycle with indirect drive by means of a chain. Bicycles were starting to take their modern form, but they were still uncomfortable to use due to the vibration from bumpy 19th century roads. Later, John K. Starley made an important improvement, attaching solid rubber tires to the wheels. The introduction of rubber tires allowed for the wheels to be smaller, as previously larger wooden wheels were used to lessen the vibration. Rubber tires created another part of the bicycle which could be improved. And in 1887, the veterinary surgeon John B. Dunlop outfitted his son's tricycle with pneumatic tires. This slide shows his son standing next to one of the later bicycle models with pneumatic tires. Most of these inventions on their own didn't make a large difference, but only when they were combined in the process of creative accumulation did they result in something significant. So no single inventor and no single moment of invention, instead a long chain of inventions and improvements that ratchet up. So ratcheting up past innovations and combining them with new innovations results in the cumulative evolution of technology, a century of trial and error, improvement and recombination to produce the modern bicycle. But how does this relate to crime fiction? Literary historians usually do not speak about the invention of genres, the term being too mechanistic to apply to the arts. However, there is one genre to which they are prepared to attribute an inventor, and there is little disagreement over who this inventor is. Poe was the inventor of the detective story, wrote Borges in 1936. A single genius who came up with a brilliant idea, so convenient. However, even the most convenient ideas should be sometimes revised. The history of the detective genre is a story about a single genius inventor, no more than the history of a bicycle is a story about a single genius engineer. Quite the contrary, like bicycles, detective fiction evolved due to ratcheting up and recombining of innovations. First, let's have a look at this figure. It shows the frequency of phrases detective story, detective fiction, detective novel, and crime fiction in the English subcorpus of the Google Ngram viewer, the largest existing book corpus. Prior to the 1880s, these phrases were extremely rare. The detective story grew first. Detective novel and detective fiction started rising in popularity only in the 1920s. And the now widespread term crime fiction became popular only in the 1970s to the 1980s. Edgar Allan Poe published his first tale of ratiocination, as he called the stories now labelled as detective fiction, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, in 1841. Why is there this large gap of almost 40 years between the supposed invention of the detective story and its popularity? To answer this question, let's return to the history of the bicycle. The first two-wheeled running machine, made by Baron von Drais in 1818, was many years before the widespread use of the bicycle, which came later at the tail end of the 19th century. And the reason is clear. His running machine wasn't a bicycle, it was a running machine, a device completely unprepared for mass production and day-to-day use. It took almost a century to develop it into something that would be useful and comfortable for most people. Poe's case may be similar. His tales of ratiocination were tales of ratiocination. To transform them into detective stories, almost a half-century of improvement was needed. A half-century of experimentation, recombination, and ratcheting up of innovations. Can we make a history of the cumulative innovation in detective fiction similar to our brief history of innovation in the bicycle? As an arbitrary endpoint, let's take Agatha Christie's first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, published in 1920, which initiated the craze for detective novels. Christie's book became a blueprint for hundreds of other writers who copied her ingenious plot twists, flat characters, and countless traps set out for her readers. However, all these components didn't actually belong to Christie. Most of them were invented during the 19th century by many famous and fameless literary inventors. The First Lady of Crime just happened to be the last link in a long chain of innovations. The final improvement, after which the mechanism of the detective novel was ready for mass production. In 1794, William Godwin composes the plot of his Caleb Williams in a highly unusual manner, from effect to cause. This will become an underlying principle of almost any detective fiction. The effect, the story of the investigation, is presented before the cause, the story of the murder. This basic temporal transposition is claimed to be a crucial device in triggering the feeling of curiosity in readers, the most distinctive emotion associated with the detective fiction genre. Edgar Allan Poe specifically credited William Godwin's Caleb Williams for teaching him how to write a narrative backwards. 1841. Poe writes the short story The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which was the first of hundreds of locked room mysteries which proposed the puzzle of a dead body found in a room which seems to be effectively sealed. Besides this, it contains several more important inventions. Primarily, the detective is depicted as a reasoning machine. The story is told by the simple-minded detective's companion, and a part of the narrative tension comes from the competition between an amateur detective and the professional police. Those four inventions will become the standard elements of the detective fiction formula. Between 1862 and 1863 was the publication of The Notting Hill Mystery by someone hiding behind the pseudonym Charles Felix. Its main innovation is that it was probably the first English-language detective novel. Besides this, it contains an important invention. It includes a map, a practice which would become common many years later, as well as facsimiles of a marriage certificate and a fragment of a torn letter, clues from within the novel. The practice of showing clues to the readers will become a rule of the genre much later. (1868) In his novel The Moonstone, Wilkie Collins makes several micro-inventions. This novel involves a crime committed in a quiet country house at which a number of people have gathered together by circumstance, and there is circumstantial evidence against virtually all of these people. This innovative feature, a closed circle of suspects, will become a standard plot device in the majority of whodunits in the 1920s and 30s. Another less important feature is that the novel's main mystery, the disappearance of the diamond, is solved by gathering together some of the main protagonists and reenacting the crime. 1891 to 1892. Arthur Conan Doyle publishes a series of short stories about Sherlock Holmes in the Strand magazine. According to Moretti, the main innovation of these stories is that some of them contain potentially decodable clues, based on which readers could potentially identify the murderer. By introducing these decodable clues, Conan Doyle creates a new type of literature, the literature game, in which readers have to outwit the author, solving the puzzle faster than the detective. So instead of passive reading, the nature of the story becomes a competition between author and reader. The detective story is created, but it is not yet a novel. 1920. Agatha Christie publishes her first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. This novel is a combination of many elements invented or popularized by her predecessors, starting from the backward narration of Godwin, through the floor plans of the Notting Hill Mystery, the country house crime of Collins, the clues of Conan Doyle, and the locked room of Zangwill and Leroux, to name just a few. It becomes the model for countless followers who have started writing similar books stuffed with country houses, floor plans, clues, and locked rooms. Agatha Christie's invention is that her book is a puzzle which permits little emotional engagement with the characters. Her first book is notable because it ushered in the era during which the detective story came to be regarded as a puzzle played by the reader. She does much the same thing that Conan Doyle did previously, but with a much more complex kind of literature, the novel. So when was the detective genre invented, and who was the inventor? These questions themselves are incorrect. The detective genre does not have a single inventor, and it wasn't invented at a single moment in time. Instead of one breakthrough invention, a long history of ratcheting them up. Importantly, these inventions were not lost, but were incorporated as parts of later stories and novels. To have a better idea of this process, look at the scheme here. This chronicle of the evolution of the detective genre shows one important thing. Between William Godwin's Caleb Williams, which technically isn't a detective story, and Agatha Christie's The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which certainly is, there lies more than a century of inventing, borrowing, and recombination. It's not at all easy to make sense of this complicated evolution, but overall the hypothesis that crime fiction becomes more complex through a process of retaining innovations and recombining them seems to have some support. Godwin's novel, the distant predecessor of contemporary detectives, has just one element of the genre. Christie's novel, the mature whodunit, already has more than a dozen of them. The ratchet of literary evolution works, and inventions, once made, don't disappear but accumulate. So what deductions can we make from these clues? Crime is a widely popular genre, and its appeal may partly be explained by its complexity and puzzle-like nature. Cumulative cultural evolution can increase the complexity of culture, which can easily be seen in technology. This complexity ratchets up in both narratives and technology, as shown by the evolution of crime fiction.